Everything had its place, and it went from, in the old days, from the most material up to the most spiritual. And this thing persists within Western civilization for a long time. The other concept that you should remember is that the universe was static, meaning it didn't change. So you have a structure that was hierarchical and with the metaphor or the technototem of the great chain of being, and nothing changed, no new species. And then last time when we left over is that there was a romantic reaction against this sort of paradigm, this kind of concept, and revival of one of the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, who believed that everything was fire. Sorry.
Oh, sound works.
Yeah.
Sound works.
Okay, now we switch over from Finland, not Finland, where's Romania's from? Sweden, yeah, switch over from Sweden down to France. And in France, there was a naturalist by the name of Buffon. And basically, because of the print and the encyclopedia tradition, is that Buffon wanted to write what we call a history of everything. So he had in nature, and he had wrote 44 volumes of a book called Histoire naturelle. And the thing was that in writing the book, for whatever reason, he questioned the idea that there were no new species. And he also questioned the idea that each species was created separately, which was part of the church doctrine. And then he even had a concept of change, but if you notice the concept of change is that instead of evolution, what was going on, he thought, was devolution. That in the beginning, God created these archetypes or these ideals. For example, the idea of Paris Hilton would be an archetype. Because she's, in my eyes, the perfect woman, right? But we're reversing things. Or John Elway is an archetype, because he's the perfect ideal. So what Buffon thought was that there would be archetypes, and then as the archetypes became more and more material, they degenerated. So Paris Hilton became, who's her friend? God, poor thing. She was on drugs for a while. What was well, who? Yeah. So you can see the type of change that's going on. It's not evolution, but devolution. But the important point of Buffon is that he's introducing the idea of change into the paradigm. And then, so this whole, then if we switch from France, we go to England, and there's a surveyor by the name of William Smith. He really wasn't a geologist, we call him a geologist these days, but basically he was a worker, he was from the working class, and his assignment and what they were doing were digging canals all throughout England. And when they were digging the canals, he had this penchant for nature and observing everything. So like Darwin, as we should see later on, he collected beetles and he just collected everything. And then he started noticing within the strata of the canal, next to the canals that they were digging, was that there were embedded in the strata fossils. And so the fossils become what, I mean, in the Kuhn scheme of things, they were anomalies. They don't fit, right? So people started digging out the fossils and showing them around. And one interpretation is that these were, that God put them there just for fun, you know. And so what he did was he understood, because of some work by an Italian geologist, is that if we look at Buffon as the top layer of strata, and where I got strata down at the bottom and everything else in between are different layers in geology. So what can you say about that strata in reference to time? I'm sorry? So you got strata on top, you're digging down, and then you get lower and lower. What's the relationship of the strata to time? Exactly. The lower you go, that means the older the strata. And then, so I remember my wife and I hiking down the Grand Canyon, and I actually had this feeling going back into time, because the lower and lower you go into that canyon, the further back you go into time, and you get a sense of what we call geological time. But remember, back in that time, how long did it take to create the universe? 7 days. Well, not really, because there was a man by the name of Usher, and he calculated the age of the Earth by taking genealogical calculations from Genesis and beyond Leviticus. And he would take these people and say, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and came up to the conclusion that the Earth was 4,004 years old. Which is interesting, because he was at least trying to quantify, which is part of the scientific revolution that was going on, is that anything that you do has to be mathematical. But what we're saying is that at this time, the time span was incredibly small. And so what Smith was beginning to see, or beginning to realize, that when he's looking at the strata, at the very bottom, and he saw the fossils, they were very simple. And then at the very top, you had very complicated, or much more complex strata. So if you would find a fossil, we'll say of a mammal, versus the fossil of a trilobite, where would you find the trilobite? Right, much deeper, and then you would see a progression from the most simple to the more complex. And what Smith did was build a geological map based on the fossils. And what he did was use the fossils as a control device in order to figure out the age of the different strata. So here's an example of the strata at the Paris Basin. And so down here you would see the basically marine fossils, simple fossils. And as you go up in the higher and higher, then you get more complicated fossils, until at the very top you have the mammals. So people are looking at this and coming to the conclusion that there must be change. But coming also to the conclusion that the change must be evolutionary from simple to complex rather than devolutionary, as Buffon had argued. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the layer at Paris and Basin of the strata, they're disrupted periodically. And the thing is, and so the Catholic priest scientist by the name of Cuvier says, oh, I know what's going on. And then in Genesis, what happened with Noah and the ark? Must be somebody, I mean, I don't know, it's some heathen, but no. I don't read that book. Uh-oh, please delete that. I'm going to get in trouble. No, what Dennis has said that what happened was, God really got upset with us because we were going around doing things we shouldn't be doing, nasty things. Like taking drugs and being like Paris Hilton. But so what God did was send the flood and wiped out everybody except Noah and his family because they were righteous, correct? Then what happened to all the animals? They put them in the ark, and that's how they were saved. And so Cuvier, being a good Catholic, says, well, here's what's going on in the scheme of things, is that God is actually creating different species from bottom up. And because and this is kind of strange but interesting, I think, is that he's not a really good craftsman, so he'll create this whole species and then send a flood down or some other disaster and wipe everything out. And you can trace the different disasters or catastrophes that happened within geological time until at the end God was happy and created man, or women, and humans. But remember, he was unhappy with that first batch. Because they were all Paris Hilton. So he had wiped them all out and then created a new species. And then and voila, nous sommes là. Here we are, right? And but the interesting thing is that even though we laugh at it now, is that it introduced the idea of evolution and the idea of evolutionary change from the simple to the more complex. But really, and when I was taught this 40 years ago, when we were reading this 40 years ago, we used to all laugh. Because we said, how can those people be so stupid? And yet, now if you're taking geology, catastrophism is a part of the natural causes of the evolution of the universe, of the Earth. And this happened because in this case, what happened was that a geologist, actually I think he was a physicist or a chemist, and his son was a geologist or a natural philosopher. And they were asking the question of why, how did the dinosaurs become extinct so suddenly? And then the chemist or the physicist at Berkeley found out that at the time of the extinctions there was this very thin layer of iridium. And the only explanation that they could come with that thin layer of iridium, which was ubiquitous all over, is that a huge catastrophe occurred, which was this huge comet that came down crashing. And that was responsible for what we call a nuclear winter. And as a consequence of the nuclear winter, most of the, I think 70–80%, they call it the Great Extinction. The species died out, with the exception of, we'll say, these little mammals that were squirreling around, and they survived, and it was from them that we evolved. So goes the theory. So now, what was considered 40 years ago ridiculous, the idea of catastrophism now part of the cradle of science, and catastrophism is a major part of any geological study. So again, this shows you how science completely changes, that what you're taught now in the textbook, 40 years from now, people may ridicule, just like they did Cuvier's idea of catastrophism 200 years ago. So, 200 years ago, the idea of catastrophism was academically correct, but the question was whether or not, what type of catastrophe is responsible for this change. And there were basically two schools. And the two schools continue today. Those who believe that the floods caused these great extinctions or changes, and the others were called volcanists. And those that believed that fire instead of water were responsible. So if fire was responsible for these great changes, then what natural phenomenon would you be looking at as a scientist? Volcanoes, right? So there would be two schools of thought. And Buckland is Burke talks about Buckland, and he was a volcanist. And he's and Burke tries to bring a little bit of humor into his video. Talks about how odd Buckland was. But even though he was an odd personality, the theories that he was postulating would have credibility at that time. So, we're at the stage now is that the universe is no longer static. That we somehow have accepted the idea of change. And now, the other thing that's going on is that in order to be scientific, we were reaching the point is that you have to be rational and that you cannot appeal to scripture, you cannot appeal to tradition, you cannot appeal to hearsay, that you had to come up with what we call natural laws. And Hudson came up with this theory or methodology called uniformitarianism. So anybody take geology in here? Right, so he's still in your textbook. It is the idea of uniformitarianism. So the basic law in geology is that you cannot explain, to explain any geological phenomenon, you have to appeal to processes, natural processes that you can observe today. So you can't go back and say, well, you have to use, for example, if you observe a comet. By the way, there's one coming, isn't there?
29.
When?
29.
29?
Yeah.
Today,
2029. No.
2029.
Yeah.
I thought it was 2012. I thought that's when it was happening. But anyway, no, there's one coming that's within, I don't know, a few million miles, but it's close enough to
Closer than
look at it.
the moon.
Yeah, there'll be another one in 2012. Then we don't have to do our project, right? It's all going to end anyway. So, but Hutton came up with according to Burke, was the first to come up with the idea of uniformitarianism, means that you're only allowed to use observable natural causes to explain any type of geological phenomenon. But the problem is that we don't accept him as one of the founders of geology, even though, by the way, he rejected Bishop Ussher's calculation that the Earth began at 9 a.m. on the 26th of October, 4004 BC. Wow. That means a few days ago, somebody do the calculation, on October 26th, we were celebrating 6,000th anniversary of the Earth, 6006. But the real founder of, according to the textbooks of uniformitarianism, is Sir Charles Lyell. And in the film, you will see that, Burke will talk about Lyell. And Burke will talk about Lyell and also Mount Etna. Lyell wrote a book called The Principles of Geology. And in that book, he stated the accepted principle of uniformitarianism, that Earth was shaped by slow-moving forces still in operation today. And he was a good friend of Charles Darwin. And in the film, what you're going to see, he's going to go up I love Burke. I wish I were Burke. And then I could go to Italy and just kind of travel up. Go up these mountains. I can sit in cafes and eat clams, with my Chardin. These Brits, they have style. Like these American. So anyway, so in the film, what he does is he drives up to Mount Etna with a bunch of tourists and talks. Can you understand it, by the way? Because he does have an accent, You're watching it.
Yeah.
Or is there a closed caption?
There is,
No.
but it's easy to understand.
You see, easy to understand because some people tell me that they have problems understanding it. Well, tell you from the Bible, no wonder. But the thing is that I had a good friend who was a priest, and he was born and raised. He was raised in England. So he looked the part of a British bishop, and we were in, and he had to fill out some forms to get some checkups and something, so filling out the forms with him, and so we're talking, and then there's a doctor or a physician who's listening in. He comes over to Father Paul and says, "Hey, I've noticed that where are you from? I noticed that you're speaking with an accent." And Father Paul says, "You bloody colonists. It's you who speak with an accent. We speak Queen's English." So, accents are relative, right? Okay. And the doctor should have known better. God, he's a medical doctor. He should know better. He would have flunked the MCAT, right? But anyway, what Burke is saying is, so he's up there, and then what happens is you have to imagine Etna erupting at such and such a time. Throughout the geological periods, and then they've been keeping records of Etna going way back. And then, so when they keep records of the lava and the flowing down and laying one strata on top of each other, they can start calculating the age of the fossils that are embedded in the strata. So there's Burke out there doing what I wish I could be doing somewhere in northern Italy, ordering seafood with a Chardonnay, right?
Filet.
Filet?
Yeah.
Was it a filet?
I don't know, but
Oh,
it's
yeah.
filet.
Yeah,
He's got
there
it.
he is. And he says, what Lyell found is that these clams here, which by the way are fresh from the market, it's not, the frozen stuff you get. King Supers. So he's savoring the clams and says these clams are exactly the same clams that you see down here in the strata that have been laid down over centuries and centuries. And so the conclusion that Lyell came to was that the Earth, again, everybody else was coming to the same conclusion, is much older than Usher's calculation of 404 BC. So when you watch the film and you and ask what he's talking about, that's what he's doing. Because he talks really fast, that's the problem. So you have to slow it down and regurgitate it. So the conclusion, therefore, is that the fossil shellfish, which is the same ones that he was eating with a Chardonnay in that beautiful outdoor cafe in Italy where they got some kind of style that we're losing, must be millions of years old based on the laying out of strata because of Mount Etna. So what we're seeing now is that this idea of evolution is in the air. And this is a scientific in the history of science, we wonder why these ideas get in the air. One of the, but what happened, there were two people, two Brits, and one was, his name was Alfred Russel Wallace, and FRS means Friends of the Royal Society, which is the most prestigious scientific institute that you can belong to. And the other was Charles Darwin, who's also a friend of the Royal Society in the States. But a little bit on Russell is that he's a surveyor, like, remember, William Smith. And therefore, by his profession, you could tell what class he came from in England. He came from the lower middle classes, and because he had to work with his hands. And he was doing the same thing that William Smith was doing. And at the same time, like William Smith, he's out there in the British countryside and starts collecting flora and fauna and looking at nature. I mean, he's out of the cities. And when he's there, for some reason, I'm not sure how, he runs into or is introduced to Henry Bates, who's an aristocrat. And see, the aristocracy at that time are taking a very keen interest in natural history. And one of the things that you could do as an aristocrat is pretend to be a natural philosopher and go out and start collecting, go on these expeditions and start collecting flora and fauna all over the world. So Bates says to Wallace, he says, why don't you come and, I'm setting up this expedition in order to collect flora and fauna down in Indonesia. Why don't you go to the Isles down there? Why don't you come with me and help me out? So what happened was that Wallace gets outside of the working class and goes on this expedition with Henry Bates, and then goes down to South America and elsewhere, and starts collecting flora and fauna. And it just turns out that Bates gives them a couple of books. One is Malthus's On Population, and the other was Lyell's Principles of Geology. And Malthus is, and who is Malthus? MCAT. Malthus is the British economist who said that he wrote a book on population, and the book said that progeny multiply exponentially, whereas food supply arithmetically. So what will happen is that we'll breed and our progeny or our population will increase exponentially, whereas the food supply will remain arithmetic. So what will happen is that, what's going to happen then? Natural selection will start fighting each other and killing each other. Food. And who will survive? The fittest. Dr. Tang, right? In this horrible, terrible, competitive world. So what happened is that Wallace, by the way, Wallace, in contrast to Darwin, when Darwin first saw the indigenous people, he freaked out. When Wallace saw them, he took off all his clothes and joined them. So, two types of personality. And Wallace comes down with malaria, and he writes, he says, I got it, and came up with the theory of evolution, exactly the way that we had outlined before as a function of differential reproduction. So he writes it down, and he had heard about this person by the name of Darwin. And with that, let's switch over to Darwin, because this is what Burke does in his story, is that here we have another person who has no acquaintance with Russell, and Darwin is also a naturalist. And by that time, and Darwin comes from what we call the landed gentry. So, in Victorian age, they would say he's a man of property. And so, basically, but at that time, even if you're a man of property, you basically had to go into some profession in England for your self-respect. His father, Darwin's father, was a doctor, physician. So Darwin's father said, "Okay, Charles, we can send you out to college. We'd like to be a doctor. Keep up the good family name." And so Darwin goes off to Cambridge, and he's one of these ne'er-do-well members of the aristocracy. All he do is go out and, drink with his fellow aristocratic friends. He loved to hunt, he loved to shoot, and chase the hounds and whatever these dumb Brits did. So, he had nothing better to do. And so what's turning out? So he goes to his first anatomy class, and evidently they had a vivisection, and Darwin faints. I hope you don't mind the sight of blood. Okay. So Darwin, anyway, so Darwin drops out of, goes back to the estate, and the father's a big, huge guy. I knew you were good for nothing. You can't even stand the sight of blood. There's nothing left for you to do. But there were basically three professions that the aristocracy, or the landed gentry, could go into. One was to be a lawyer or a doctor, or you could go into the priesthood. You could become a cleric, or you could join the military. Well, the military was out, right? So, and then he decided to become a priest because a cleric, because it's like becoming a psychologist. It's easy. You don't have to worry about the competition. You don't do anything. So he decided to become a cleric and goes back to Cambridge. But while he's back at Cambridge, he encounters people like Charles Lyell. And on his hunting, when he goes hunting, he starts, like Smith, like Wallace, starts getting very interested in his natural surroundings. So he starts collecting and becomes a naturalist. And so this continues, but even though he is in the Mickey Mouse profession, studying Mickey Mouse stuff, he's flunking. And so he goes back, and the father says, "No, I don't know what to do with you. You can't even pass these courses in rhetoric." And so the uncle stands and says, "Hey, I know. There's a job opening up on this military ship called the Beagle. And what they need," and the textbooks will say that that the captain needed a natural philosopher. Not true. What the captain wanted was a companion. You have to remember, it's because the British society is, it's pretty class conscious. It was a big thing. In that last wedding, that dumb prince, I'm sorry, my boss is why was it a big thing that Prince Charles or Prince Andrew got married? Why was it a big thing in England? Because he was marrying a commoner. He's marrying somebody from the middle class, the lower class, according to the aristocrats. So anyway, Darwin's purpose was to be a companion to the captain. Now, look at this as a metaphor, and look at the ship as a technototem. And what it tells you about British society is that all the officers came from where? The upper class. And all your others were the lower classes, your sailors, the people who really did the work. So what happened was that Darwin was hired in order to keep Captain Fritjov company, to be his companion throughout the voyage of the Beagle. And when Darwin was being interviewed for the job, Captain Fritjov said, "By the way, you're perfect. I think this is going to work out fine. But I got one question for you. There's this concept or this idea that's in the air called evolution." And Fritjov says, "Young man, you take no credence in that theory, do you?" And Darwin says, "No." I mean, which is the truth, because he really didn't care either way. He just wanted to get out of Cambridge and then go on the ship. And so Darwin joins Captain Fritjov, who was a very good Christian, on the voyage of the Beagle. And there's the trip. And so they start off from England, and they go down to South America, to Rio de Janeiro, up there to the Galapagos, and then around, basically around the world. Somewhere along the line, the naturalists that they hired went off on an island and went insane and never came back and never found him. And so Darwin took over the role of the naturalist on the ship. And we have the recordings because when Darwin started looking at all this from the point of view of the naturalist, the idea of evolution kept creeping into his mind. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that on the way, before he took off on the ship, his friend Lyell came to him and said, "Hey, I just published a book. It's called The Principles of Geology. I'm going to give it to you." And Lyell said something really strange. He says, "But under no circumstances read it." The other book that he got was Malthus's On Population. So Darwin starts collecting species. And remember, he's empirical, right? There's no reason that he wants to accept the theory of evolution. In fact, it's not to his advantage to accept it, but or much less to articulate it. So he lands in the Galapagos, and then he goes shooting, of course, shooting everything he can. And then, but what he noticed you should get this in, you used to get this in your biology books, right? So, and what you see is that you've got all these different finches, and they all have different types of beaks. In the old days, according to the naturalists, the reason for this is that God created each of these finches with their specific beak so that they could strive within their particular environment. So what Darwin found, sure enough, is that you got these three finches, and they all had beaks that are bills that are parrot-like, and they were progressed. And then on the other side, you got the warbler finches, and then you got the cactus finches, and the warbler finches, all of them turned out to be insect eaters. And then you have the cactus eaters that are able to poke into the cacti with their particular bill, particular beak. Then you've got the ground finches, which are the seed eaters. And so you notice this one, this beak or this bill is particularly adapted to crunch seeds and nuts and this type of thing. So what he's finding is a correlation between different ecological niches and a particular characteristic of the species, which are the bills with their beaks and nails. So the conclusions of, after a while, he came to the exact same conclusion as Wallace. And so he goes home, and he's got all this data, and somewhere along the line in his head he comes up with a theory of evolution, which is exactly like Wallace's. And finally he puts it down on paper. And to show what type of person he is that he goes to his wife Emma Wedgwood. So how is the name Wedgwood familiar? It's China. It's a British. So in my generation, the women, when they married, they made sure that they would have Wedgwood china and silver, Tiffany's silver. So what we're saying is that Emily Wedgwood is not of the gentry class, but her father made his millions as a manufacturer of what we call Queensware. And today, still, what you want to do is have Wedgwood, right, along with your Tiffany. And so he goes to his wife Emma and gives her a brief manuscript, which is the theory of evolution, and says, Emma, when I die, because he was sick all the time, and was psychosomatic, and also, what I want you to do is take this manuscript to Charles Lyell and have him publish it. And just to show what type of person he is, he put enough money into the will, or into the box with the manuscript, so that they would be able to pay for the publishing. And then after that, he just didn't say anything, went back and started to work on barnacles and other things and collecting more data or more information that would support the theory of evolution. And that's when he receives this letter from Wallace. And Wallace, in the letter, Wallace writes, it says, Dear Dr. Darwin, or Dear Mr. Darwin, who was the doctor, it says that I've been down in the South Seas for 3 years and been collecting evidence, and I've come up with a theory, and I want to know what you think about it. And the theory, of course, was exactly Darwin's theory of evolution. And Darwin writes back and says, Dear Mr. Wallace, this is the exact same theory that I came up with 10 years ago on the voyage of the Beagle, with the exception that yours is written better and more concise. And what Darwin does is invites Wallace up to back to England, and that they would present the theory of evolution together. And out of that came Darwin's book on the origins of the species, 1859. Why don't we call it Wallace's theory of evolution? Because Wallace was a commoner. And also, Wallace turned out to be a socialist, and that was not very good. And also, Wallace turned out to be a spiritualist, so his scientific credentials became suspect. And when it's handled, we can't have a socialist, commoner, spiritualist name attached to the very scientific theory and call it Wallace's theory of scientific theory. So, in 1859, The Origins of the Species is published. On the origins of the species by means of natural selection. or the preservation, this is important, the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. That's why we have the bell curve in this course. Congratulations. No wishy-washy liberal up here thinks that everybody's equal. Right? We've empirically proven, shown, that you are fit. Now, when you go out into the real world, you will survive. Because you went through Dr. Tang's natural selected class. So, okay. Didn't mean that. Anyway, but what's interesting is that let's look at this as a technototem, which I just did, is that when it was published, there were other people who were very much attracted to it. And one was a German by the name of Ernst Haeckel. He states he was a biologist, a naturalist, philosopher, physician, and professor. And he's known in the history of science for promoting and popularizing the theory of evolution in Germany. And he's got this famous theory, which is called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which basically means that we as individuals repeat the same process as the species. So if you look at the embryo, what does it look like in its stages of development? A little fish. And that embryo becomes a little frog. And it becomes, so ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And he wrote a letter to Darwin after the publication of The Origin of the Species. It says, "Dear Mr. Darwin, this is exactly the book I need, or the theory I need to justify the ideology that's emerging in Germany." And that ideology was the ideology of Nazism. So why does Darwin's theory fit this ideology? Das ist die Übermenschen. So if you're the Untermenschen, like the Jews, what do you do with them? Make it happen. Send them to the gas chamber, right? Because they're holding up evolution. And what they didn't want, what the Nazis did not want, was to have the Jews to pollute their blood, to prefer to result in inferior progeny in order to obstruct the destiny of the Übermensch, which is translated what? The Superman. So what Haeckel was doing was saying, hey, I mean, here we have this completely mathematical theory. And this German Nazi writes, Darwin says, I want to write the preface for it, because this is exactly the scientific evidence that we need in order to promote the idea of the Übermensch und der Will zur Macht. Now, at the same time, in England, there was a man by the name of Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer also wrote and said, hey, Mr. Darwin, I'd like to write the preface to your book, The Origin of Species. And he happens to be, I think, maybe Wired Magazine, but it's Modern Interpretation. So there's two different readings. And then out of this comes a new scientific paradigm, which is not accepted yet. It's not accepted in the United States, even though it's being taught at one university in the United States. But it's being more accepted in Europe. And then what happens in terms of physics, what we're going to do is look at Burke. And he's got this thing called waves, making waves. And basically, this is on the history of electricity and how the history of electromagnetic phenomena is causing anomalies. And remember, going back to Kuhn, is that whenever you have anomalies, they're accepted, that people don't get upset for a while until somebody just looks at the anomaly and says, no, it just doesn't work. What we have to do is come up with a completely new paradigm. And the person to do that is Einstein. So you'll be reading that in the other Burke thing called the New Physics. And then out of Einstein comes two disparate theories. One is relativity, and the other is quantum mechanics, which is a misnomer because there's nothing mechanical about quantum theory, even though your physicists want to fit it into the Newtonian paradigm. So, and then out of this, and we're still looking for a new paradigm that would hold everything together, right? And Kuhn says that you're going through a paradigm shift, or things are changing when you have all these conflicting paradigms and they're all incommensurable. They don't fit with each other. And so we're going through this transitional phase. So, and as I mentioned before, it's a shift in paradigm. And I don't worry about it because I'm going to be dead soon. But not soon. I mean, you know what I'm saying. I mean, that it takes, I mean, I don't worry about it because I'm too old to worry about it. And also, as I mentioned before, that I take Prozac and drink Jim Beam, so I don't have to worry. But fortunately, I mean, you can look at it two ways, is that your generation is going through something unprecedented because there are no models anymore. Whatever you do, oh, you better delete this. Whatever you do, don't listen to your parents, right? No, but the point is that scientifically we're going through some incredible changes, and we don't know what those changes mean. And I'm hoping that from this class you get a feel that there's a reason behind it, and I think the reason is because of our changes in science and technology, because it's always been that way. When science changes, then society, the rest of society follows. So let's talk about Chardin. Now, you have to remember that when I talk about these people, it's not necessarily that I believe in their ideals. And this is especially clear with Chardin. And but I'm going to try to be as objective about it as I can, because Chardin turns out to be a Christian and a Catholic. And of course, that's immediately going to bias me, right? But hopefully that you reached a time in your intellectual development is that you can look at somebody, look at or read things in which you don't get involved with personally. And that's the whole process of education, is that you're able to look at things in detachment and without getting all upset and saying, Merchant, she's a feminist, she sucks. You know, hopefully, and you've shown that with, most of you, showed that with your essays. It's that you're able to rise above this emotional reaction toward someone or some reading that you don't agree with. So at the same time, I must admit, I really like Chardin. And another thing, I've forgotten your name again. I mean, I just went, well. Pavna. Yeah, whatever you do, don't take notes on Chardin because, you know, the traditional biologists are going to get upset. But remember, I'm not teaching biology. I'm teaching the history of biology, and there's a big difference, right? So don't take this down as fact, and don't go out and tell your professors that Dr. Tang is teaching this Catholic mystic priest. And he should be kicked out, okay? You never know. Remember, this is a paranoid generation, according to McLuhan, because everything is, I mean, notice email is very paranoid. And now nobody wants to pick up the phone anymore because you know it's going to be bad news, right? My TAs hate it when I call them. Oh, God. They prefer email. And it's a function of the technology, correct? And that's what we're trying to get a feel for. So, in this International Dimensions course, what I'm trying to do is, I'm arguing that Europe is really a different culture. And I think the more and more we look at it, the more and more I can do it. Because a lot of people just lump Europe into Western culture, and to justify this course the way the liberals want, they want me to talk about China. And I said, what the hell do I know about China? I mean, but anyway, so what we want to do is look at, and what we've been doing with this course is we emphasize that we can write this entire history without even mentioning the United States. And also the other thing that I'm arguing is that as far as the revolutionary discoveries that have happened in the 20th century is that they came from Europe and not from the United States. And so here we have, I'm going to give you an overview of Chardin's theory of evolution. And so, c'était en français. If you look, the first stage of evolution, according to Chardin, is pré-vie, or before life, which I think fits into the textbooks pretty much, correct? I mean, and then we go from pré-vie to vie, which is what? Life, exactly. Hannah, you don't know French, you just inferred it, right? I mean, that's logic. Yeah. This is so then from vie, we go into another evolutionary stage, and this is where Chardin is getting controversial, and where all the biologists are getting upset, is that we're evolving toward pensée, which is sentience, awareness, that the universe itself is beginning to be able to think about itself. And of course, you can see this I mean, you can tell it doesn't fit the mechanistic idea of evolution that we're taught in the textbooks today. This is, yeah. And then the last stage is also even more. So you've got examples of pre-life, which is biomolecules, megamolecules, molecules, simple bodies, and then multiple inorganic particles, such as energy particles, which fits into the traditional. And then you come up with V, which is At the very top, notice the great chain of being. At the very lowest, what do you have as a form of life? Virus, right? And then above that, you have the protozoas, and then you have the microorganisms, and then comes this process of photosynthesis, and then you have reproduction sexuelle. I'm saying it in French so nobody reports me. Right? Because at DU, they got the 75-year-old professor for, I don't know. I mean, but like I said, these paranoid times, you can't be too careful. So, et maintenant, nous avons été à l'époque sexuelle. Okay. Okay, so that, and then, but that, you know, evolutionarily speaking, I mean, that's why Linnaeus focused on the sexual organs of the plants. It's not because he was a pervert. It's because that's the way that you would look objectively as how you're going to come up with a taxonomy, even involving plants. So, of course, which plants are more mature, I mean, more higher up on the evolutionary scale, are the plants that have evolved into sexual reproduction. So, and then out of that came up there, meta what? No, I don't know what that means. Then up there comes the animals, and then finally mammals, which we are a part of. So if you're the Pope, why are you upset? Because here's this Catholic priest teaching evolution. And this is back in the early part of the 20th century where, I don't know, the popes, they've been getting more and more reactionary. They probably still would be upset the way things are going. Are there Catholics in here? God, I'm safe. Anyway, if I were a Catholic, I wouldn't admit it. Okay, so here we are. But here's where the whole thing so when we have evolved into what they call the sentient stage, or in this case is pensée, which translates to thinking or thought. So according to this scheme of things, is that the thinking stage or the sentient stage begins even before humans. And then what we're evolving and what we're going through now, and we'll continue to do so, is the pas de la réflexion, which means the stages of thinking, or the stages of sentience. And that's what, according to Chardin, makes us human, right? I mean, the mechanical philosophers knew better. I mean, so for Chardin, there's something basically immoral about taking that cat in the 18th century and nailing him up to a board and slitting him, his entrails. And then when he screamed, all the mechanical philosophers simply said, "C'est pas grand-chose, c'est un mécanisme." He says, no big deal, he's just a mechanical entity. So we do sense that there's a paradigm shift going. There's a sense of a different way of looking at things and back into Descartes' age that's going on. And I think Chardin is part of that evolution. And so what happens is that in the, see, what's going on is that the universe, according to Chardin, is waking up. But not only is the universe waking up, but we're waking up too as a human species. I can refute that just by talking to my fellow professors. They're completely asleep, right? But hopefully your generation, along with the universe, is starting to become more and more aware and starting to wake up, according to Chardin. But, and here's where he's a good Catholic, is that we've reached what we call the, finally, so we go from Pensée, he gives a different sphere. It's not here, but we're entering this thing called the new sphere. And he calls it survie, meaning meta life or above life. So you can see where his Christianity is coming in. But we'll look at some more details of it because as we will see that Chardin was a highly educated priest and that these ideas got him into trouble with the church. But we're at this omega stage, is right here, and you see the linear progression. Oh, there it is, convergence on omega. Or you see the downward vector. And and I think this is what got Chardin in trouble with the church for whatever reason, is that it's at this stage we can make the choice between which direction the evolution should go. So as a good Catholic, he believes in free will, and we're at this omega point where we have to decide, because if we don't decide right, what's going to happen in 2012, right? So since I'm a pessimist, we might as well start partying now because we're going to make the wrong choice, right? So that's the basic theory. And so a little bit about his background, which I don't know if you have the first part is his biology. So you know how to approach this reading for the text. So if you have a, oh, I didn't. Okay, we'll go through. I'll just go through the overview, and then we'll go through bring your books the next time, and we'll go through on how to read it. But he was born, Chardin, so you could tell by the name, is French. And he was born in a little village in northern France or southern France. Well, I've forgotten. But the important thing was, the important thing was that he lived in this part of France where the geology was very different. And if you look below there, there's this beautiful lake, and it was a very rural, small village. And at a very young age, he became fascinated with nature, like the rest of our biologists, because he became very interested and fascinated with geology and also anything natural. And the town, he comes from a very old French family, and they could trace his lineage back to Voltaire. It was after Descartes. Voltaire was at that time considered one of the first atheists because he was a secular Frenchman. He had to flee France because the church was after him for his teachings. And Voltaire wrote a book called Candide, and basically talked about how naive most of his country people, or most of the people in Europe, were. And Candide means, an ingénu, somebody who's not very sophisticated. That they just ingenuous is the word. So, and then Candide in the book, there's a famous saying that says that this is the best of all possible worlds. And everybody makes fun of it. Or people made fun of it. But in my old age, I'm beginning to think there might be some truth to it. So, Chardin then grew up in this town, and then when he was very young, he was very devoted. I mean, he was very devoted to his family, not only his parents, especially to his mother, and then to his brothers and sisters. And then I'm not quite sure what happened. It's in your reading, but the mother cut off a lock of his hair, and then. And why the mother did this, I don't know, but took the hair and just put a match to it and just burst into flame. And Chardin says that was, it occurred to him at a very young age of the truth of Heraclitus. Remember we looked at the Heraclitus tape. Everything is fire and everything is changing and everything is transitional. But instead of being depressed by it, he said he had a vision. So he says. I mean, this is all church propaganda, you know. But he had this vision that there was something, that fire was the essence, or that fire was divine. And so from then on, because he came from a very devout family, he decided to go into the priesthood. And so he went to the local seminary, or the local seminary. And it turned out to be a Jesuit seminary. So, again, you sure there are no Catholics here? Well, no, I'm not. It's that. Did any of you go to Catholic school? Okay, when I was in college, there would be this, a person would come in and we could point out, it says Jesuit education. Meaning that we knew, I mean, you could just tell that this person was better educated than the rest of us because he had this very rigid Catholic private school education. And so, and it turns out that of all the most intellectual of the Catholics were the Jesuits because they had this high value for the intellectual tradition. And so he went to a Catholic, so he became a member of the Jesuit priesthood. And then at the same time, when he was going to school, they had a very liberal pope who didn't see any conflict between science and religion. In fact, the pope encouraged the convergence of science and religion. So he was, as a Jesuit, coming from this very highly intellectual tradition, and also under the regime of a pope that encouraged scientific efforts, he was able to pursue his other love, which was biology and eventually paleontology. And that's where he would become famous, is in paleontology. And when he joined the priesthood, then after that, I mean, your life isn't your own. So what they did was they sent him, when he got his master's degree, they sent him to Egypt to teach at the College of the Holy Family. Notice, a Catholic institution. And in a lot of ways, that's how the Catholics were very influential in China, as we will see, is because they would set up a superior form of education in these so-called developing countries. And so when he was in Egypt, he studied physics and chemistry, taught physics and chemistry. And at this time, no, not at this time, but later on, so that shouldn't be there. is that he read a book called L'Évolution Créatrice. So Hannah, how would you translate it, even though you don't know French?
The evolution, the creator's evolution.
Sure, creative evolution. Now, you can't write a book at that time called Creative Evolution, is because, it's like, evolution by design. It's just something that's not comme il faut. It's not academically correct. But he read a book entitled Creative Evolution by Henri Bergson. And Bergson was a famous philosopher in France. And everybody loved him, but nobody took any of his ideas seriously, mainly because he was going against the tenor of the time, which was materialistic and positivist. And to be a scientist, you had to believe in the material reality of the universe. And not only that, to be a scientist, if you were an atheist, that would even be better, right? And then, while he was in Egypt, he had a lot of academic freedom. So he continued his interest in biology and paleontology. And then his education and his priesthood was interrupted by the First World War, which is a milestone in European history. And one reason is that, remember with Darwin, all the officers were members of the aristocracy in the upper crust. Same thing during World War I was that all the officers were members of the upper crust. And so you had a society in which these people ruled. And then they went over into Europe. I mean, then when World War I broke out, there was this incredible slaughter that went on because of the mechanization of war. And a good example it would be, there's this French military school, and they were all studying to be officers. And this is the class that Chardin came from. And when World War I broke out, they said, everyone was really happy because we were going through this thing called the La Belle Epoque, and there hadn't been a war for maybe 30 years. And they all went out and they polished their boots and polished their brass and took their sabers. And, they had their lances because they were a member of the elite cavalry regiment. And I think about in 1915, 1916, the entire regiment charged into the German trenches, and the Germans had machine guns, right? And wiped out the entire regiment. But see, that was happening all over Europe because all your soldiers, the members of the elite corps, like the cavalry, were from the upper crust. So it's estimated that 2/3 of the men who were members of the ruling class in Europe were killed during the war. And so that took the opportunity, that opportunity enabled Europe to become democratic, because then the middle classes had to take over the posts and the governing posts of the elite, simply by virtue of the numbers of men who were slaughtered in Europe during that time. But Chardin, being a priest, first of all, his priesthood wanted to keep him out of the war as much as they could. And then finally, they couldn't do it any longer, so he ended up being sent to North Africa, where he was a stretcher bearer or a medic. And strange things evidently happened during the war. World War I was responsible for what we call the lost generation, and these were members of the middle class, upper middle class in Europe who went to the war, and then after they came back, they were lost because all their value systems were completely changed by the war, so some of your greatest poets and your greatest writers come out of what we call the lost generation because of their experience during the war, World War I. Interesting thing with Chardin, and we know this because he was very close to his sister, and he kept writing journals or letters to his sister telling about his experiences during World War II. And he said the only way, that's where he became converted. Because he said that for some people, most of my fellow soldiers became existentialists, they became despairing. But for him, and there's the quote, the war was a meeting with the absolute. And so his faith was confirmed in the war instead of attenuated or destroyed by the experiences of the war. And unlike, our heroes like George Bush, who, joined the National Guard so that he didn't have to go to Vietnam. His dad got him his, not the deferment, but got him into the National Guard, right? And the reason you went into the National Guard in those days is so that you didn't have to go and fight. And so he went through the entire war fighting in some of the most brutal battles during World War I. And for him, it was a crucible, a baptism of fire, but what it did, instead of making him disillusioned, he became more and more convinced of the truth of his religion. Okay, so after the war, then he continued his education at the Sorbonne, which is, how many have been to Paris? Okay. You got to go. I mean, it's a different culture, right? And their educational system is completely different. I think I mentioned this before, is that first of all, there are no really central buildings. I think this is really a museum, and the lecture halls are scattered all over this thing called the West Bank. And so when you go there, if you're a student, I mean, you look at the students, this was 40 years ago, and it might have changed, probably has changed, but 40 years ago, all the students are sitting out, in the coffee house. They wear black berets. I mean, the men were, the women too, and they smoke Goas. God, what a horrible cigarette. So they smoke and drink black coffee. It's kind of like, that's where Starbucks started, right? So it's been changed. And then they'd sit around talking about philosophy and other things. And they never went to class. What's the catch? Of course, no. I mean, why would you go to class if you could sit? No, no, they never went to class. I mean, every once in a while they would attend a lecture, and the professor will have an announcement. So, by the way, Chardin is giving a lecture on paleontology, and then you might show up because you really wanted to hear Chardin. The other catch was that you didn't have midterms. But this is still the same way in Japan, by the way. Is that what will happen is that at the end of 4 years in those days, you have to take a comprehensive exam that will test you on the 4 years that you spent in college. Whether it was, and if you were in geology, it'd be 4 years of geology. Now they changed that now, where you take an exam every year. So there are no grades. But what will happen is that they will publish the list of where you, how well you did on the exam, with the top people at the top, going down, and then there'll be a cut-off point as to whether you graduated or not. So I'm sure Chardin did very well under those systems. Another person that did very well was Jean-Paul Sartre, an existentialist that went the other way. When he went through the war, he became an atheist. And, but so you can see different people, different people react different ways according to different situations. So he got his PhD in 1922, and I'm sorry for lingering into that, because I remember the first time I went to Paris, right? And it'll stay with you. So I encourage, for a cultural aspect, is to go there and see something different, or experience something different. So after getting his PhD, what was happening? What happened after he got his PhD is that he started publishing his works in paleontology, and as in the case of Galileo, remember when Galileo published, he had one of his best friends became Pope, and when the best friend became Pope, that's when he started publishing everything. And not only did Galileo started publishing everything, he started rubbing the noses of his old professors into his discoveries. And that's why they got him, is because he was of this personality, is that when he was in the position, he was able to denigrate and irritate his professors, who were at that time against the Copernican hypothesis. But in Chardin's case was that he wasn't a personality like Galileo. He just wanted to publish his scientific works. And a succession of popes followed who were very, very conservative. And so what he did was basically, and he was getting more and more controversial, so what he did was just simply exile himself to China. He says, I've had enough of this, I'll go off to China. Also, his sister was a nun doing missionary work in China. So he went to, became a professor at the Catholic Institute, and he was there for 20 years. And this is what we called, when you go through your reading, this is his voyage years, when he traveled a lot. And he was the first to come up with a general geological map of China. And he was also on the same team that discovered Peking Man. On that, but it's very interesting because he's working with Europeans. He's working with non-Catholics. Because if he were working with the members of the Catholic Church, and also he was working in China, so that he was free as far as the scientific inquiry is concerned. So, we know what happened in the United States if you taught evolution during the same time. There's this famous thing called a Scopes trial between, there was a professor in, I think, Mississippi or Tennessee. I think it was Tennessee. Yeah, in Tennessee, was teaching evolution in the classrooms. And what happened was that the school board went after him. And Scopes decided to defend himself. And he got one of the best lawyers in the country called William Jennings Bryan to defend him. And so there's this famous thing called Scopes trial, and it's also called the monkey's monkey trial, and went through a long period. And the country was riveted with the trial because the defense lawyer was William Jennings Bryan, who was also running for the President of the United States at that time. And so, what was the verdict? Scopes, this is 1920. Was Scopes found guilty or not guilty for teaching evolution in the classrooms? Is anybody? Guilty, of course, right? This is America. You can't teach evolution in the classrooms. In fact, to this day, if you taught evolution, if you did not teach evolution as a theory in Tennessee, you can get arrested. Michael, don't put this down, but if you stated that evolution was a fact in Tennessee, the thought police, I mean the real police, would come and usher you out of the classroom and lock you up with all the other perverts. Here I stand. Evolution is a fact, folks. Come and get me. But I mean, it's no big deal for the scientists now because we all know evolution's a theory, right? So it's no big deal. But, you know, the people in Tennessee, they're so confused. They haven't caught up yet that every scientific idea is a theory. So they got it on their books. If you teach it as a fact, then you're in trouble. But, you know, anyway. Thank God you're in Colorado. Okay, so he discovers a Peking man, and he's working with another European by the name of Henri Drouot, and they coined the Peking man Homo fabricus. See, if you went to a Jesuit school, you know what that would mean, because they force you to take, they used to anyway, take Latin. It means man the tool maker. And what Chardin is arguing argues in his book is that in the evolutionary stage is that one of the greatest achievements in our evolutionary development, which, by the way, is toward sentience, is toward waking up, is toward greater consciousness, is our ability to be able to use tools. And so he, remember, he was always fascinated with fires because he had his mystical experience when he was 12 years old. And he said the first tool that was revolutionary, that resulted in a quantum leap in consciousness, was our invention of fire. And it's interesting to see his interpretation because the existentialists, not Sartre, but a man by the name of, an existentialist by the name of Albert Camus, was talking about the Greek legend where the bearer of fire, or the person who, or the mortal, there was a mortal who stole fire from the gods and brought it down to the humans, or brought it down to humankind. And as the punishment, they took the mortal, strapped him to a rock, and have a vulture come by and tear at his heart through all eternity, because the person had the hubris, the audacity to try to help out the human kind by giving them fire. So to Chardin, this technology was equally to Chardin too. He thought that this was the first technology that signified a major breakthrough in the development of our consciousness. And so here's this a picture of a Peking man and how this technology completely transformed us. And the thing was that, so he continued to teach his theory of evolution, and he's not trying to reconcile it with the Catholic Church. He's just trying to say, hey, not that Darwin was wrong, but Darwin didn't give the correct interpretation of evolution. And he also, remember, read Henri Bergson, who wrote the book Creative Evolution. And in that book, he said, he was saying the same things that Chardin was saying, is that what drives evolution was this thing Bergson called the élan vital, something very, a vital force, a living force. Now, if you're a scientist in the 20th century, why would you, what would your reaction be? Ain't scientific. Because the dictating paradigm is that, remember Merchant talking about it, is that Merchant was saying that after the scientific revolution, is that after the Cartesian revolution, the metaphor was a clock, and that the universe is made of inert atoms run by natural law. And that was the important thing about Merchant, is because it was the feminist philosophers who saw first that the old mechanistic paradigm may be breaking down. And so whether or not you're a feminist, whether you're male or female, the important thing is to realize that after her going to Cornell, she was saying, hey, something's wrong. There's a paradigm change going on. And she happened to think that that paradigm change, or what was going on with the old philosophy, is that the old scientists, like Francis Bacon, conflated the scientific enterprise with torturing the female earth. And that was the metaphor that she used. It was a metaphor. And right, we've reached the stage where we can recognize the metaphor. And that, you know, so, and you have too, because I used to get essay exams that says, I don't like Merchant, she sucks. Besides that, she's a Nazi feminist. I'm supposed to grade that? Okay, so again, I mean, it's a theory, what Merchant is saying. I mean, it's a scientific theory. I mean, a social science theory. So anyway, to conclude, what happened was that Chardin was getting an international reputation among, especially in the Protestant countries, especially in the non-Christian countries, and no, everywhere actually, even in the United States, and for his scientific work. And then he was invited to speak at the Catholic University of Boston, and where they were going to confer an honorary degree, honorary PhD, even though he already had his PhD. And then just when he was going to go out on the podium to accept the degree and make his speech, the members of the, not the Inquisition, but you know, the Pope have their own secret police. But they basically said, sorry, Dr. Chardin, you can't, we can't give you the degree and you can't speak. So, you know, because the Pope called him up and said, listen, if you give him the degree, you're in big trouble. And so he had this controversy all his life, and then, but evidently, and here's something we can check empirically. It could be pure coincidence. He says, so he's getting, I mean, not desperate, what's the word? A little bit discouraged because the church won't accept his ideas. And then he said, if in my life I haven't been wrong, I beg God to allow me to die on Easter Sunday. So now that you have Google, what are you going to do? Yeah, you can see if he died on, so you Google him, and yeah, sure enough, he died on Easter Sunday at 6 p.m. Not only that, remember, and you can interpret this any way you want, is that what were Steve Jobs' last words? Oh, wow. Well, we don't know how he said it. But Steve Jobs, remember he, before he invented the Apple computer, he says, I don't know what's going on, but there's this force driving me. I wish to go to India. And then he became a Buddhist, which was, I mean, nobody knew, I mean, because he was very private. And so we know from his sister and from the doctors is that when he died awake. Usually when we die, we just slip into a coma. Very few people die awake, meaning that he was lucid and he could talk. And so he was talking to his sister, or he was awake, and his sister said, it's almost as if Steve were climbing a mountain because his breath started to get more and more, he was breathing harder. And then finally, when he got to the top of the mountain, I don't know, we don't know, he said, oh, wow. Anyway, so we know it's empirical. What it means, we don't know. And we don't know what it means. That it could be, I mean, it's just pure coincidence, or maybe the Catholic Church is trying to redeem themselves with Chardin. So, okay. The criticism of the Gaia theory, and basically Lovelock's response was that Gould and Dawkins didn't understand the mathematics. And so here's a model of Lovelock's mathematics, which is nonlinear. It's also systems mathematics, designed to show the relationship between the different parts. And I think he may have a point there, because we know that the old biology is basically statistical, and what Gould is using is nonlinear mathematics. So what he's come up with is not only a mathematical model, but a simulation game of the survival of the fittest, according to the new Gaia theory, where you play around with black daisies and white daisies. And the mathematical model shows how plants and animals, what we call co-evolve. And the saying is that you'll see in the film, Mind Walk, is that the new concept of evolution is not that we evolve on the planet, but we evolve with the planet. And so we're talking about a new type of Darwinism that involves coevolution. So the Gaia hypothesis then is taking place in Europe in the ecological sciences, because now we have a conceptual model, or a new model that favors the idea of ecological systems. And it's emerging as a mainstream science, but mainly in Europe and in the following areas of geophysiology, earth system science. And then in Europe, there's a new journal, or a new organization called Gaia Society for Research and Education in Earth System Sciences. And I would submit that not only in these areas, but in other areas, that the Europeans are getting ahead of the United States, especially not only the Europeans, but Canada. I would submit now that, I mean, in the old days when I was applying for medical school, I was going to apply to a Canadian school as my safe school. And the school I was going to apply to was McGill University. And I thought it was going to be a good school because from the name I thought McGill must be a private school. Well, it turns out that all the universities in Canada are public schools or state schools. And then, so 40 years ago, you would apply for medical school to McGill as a safe school, and now it's harder to get into med school in McGill than it is to get into Harvard. So that we see the changes going on. And so you might, if you want, you know, if you're thinking about a good education change, and you don't want to leave North America, you might look into some of the Canadian schools. Of course, the problem is that you're going to have to pay international student fees. But my feeling is that even if you pay the international fees, that will be cheaper than going to a private graduate school in the United States. And that's because the Canadian universities are highly subsidized. So, Lovelock then makes certain predictions. Did you have something? Did you have a question? Okay. And the predictions that he gave at the Munich conference is that, and at the Kyoto conference, is that his prediction of global warming is pretty pessimistic. And the reason people are looking at the Gaia theory is because the Gaia theory was one of the first biological models to predict global warming as a man-made anthropogenic phenomenon. And what Lovelock is predicting is that the desiccation of Earth in the north, in the south of the equator, and then here's the quote that came: by 240, parts of the Sahara Desert will have moved into Middle Europe. We're talking about Paris, as far north as Berlin. In Britain, we will escape because of our oceanic conditions. So, in the final analysis, if we look at Lovelock's prediction, he's fairly pessimistic. So, after that, in the article that you'll be reading, which is from Wikipedia, is that they'll talk about the influences. And one influence was Fritjov Capra, a book called The Web of Light. And the reason I put that up is because the movie the film that you're going to be seeing at the end is from that. It's based on that particular work of Capra called the movie's called Mind Walk. The other thing, Stephen Harding is another interest. And evidently, Asimov has not so much influenced Gaia, but in his science fiction has been predicting some biological theories similar to Gaia. And then we have, again, the Capra movie that you'll be watching is Mind Walk. And I'll give you a little introduction so that you can relate the Gaia theory to the film that you'll be seeing. In Mind Walk, what you'll encounter is that there are three main characters in Gaia. One is a poet, an American poet, and the other is an American politician, and the third is a physicist. And the physicist is played by Ullman, who is comes from one of the repertoire of Bergman's movies. I don't know. Michael, you're familiar with Ingmar Bergman, the filmmaker, right? Which, and again, and so, but the interesting twist, of course, is that the physicist is female, which is pure fiction, because there are no female physicists, right? Sorry. So, and we know the reason why. I mean, we studied some of the aspects. And she takes a position that is indicative of the new physics that we'll be talking about and closing the class out with. And then the politician is kind of a I would compare him to Al Gore, but Al Gore is so dumb I can't make that conclusion. But the politician is somebody who ran for president and lost, and in the primaries lost the Democratic nomination, and so he's in bad straits, and he calls up his friend who's living in Paris. And says, hey, I really need to talk to somebody. I've got to get away from here. Can I come over to Paris and stay with you? And what they do is that they visit a tourist spot called, a cathedral in France called Mont Saint-Michel, which is a beautiful cathedral. And they look at the cathedral, which hopefully you should be able to do from this course, as a metaphor. Because we've been talking about metaphors over and over again, and the metaphorical way of thinking, I would argue, is a higher order of thinking. And that's why you're at the university, is to be able to think on that level. And the metaphor of Mont Saint-Michel is a metaphor for the old paradigm in the Middle Ages. And what the three people are doing is talking about the shift in the paradigm that's taking place because of the new sciences. And then the other part is to have a context to it, where a poet would say, look at this new physics and try to determine what a poet would think about it. And of course, the poet turns out to be Capra, who's a physicist's brother, because the brother is a filmmaker and an artist himself. So it's basically the brother who's a filmmaker and artist looking at the work of his brother, who is a physicist from the University of Vienna, and who understands this new physics that's emerging. And then, but the real physicist, so Capra is being played by a female, or the ideas, Capra's ideas are being presented by a woman. And I think that's appropriate, because one of the things that are going on, I think, is the evolution of people like Harding. I mean, not Harding, but Merchant. People who are actually able to come to the grasp of the new sciences and somehow predict where the new sciences are going. And if the memes are correct, what we see is the continued evolution of women in this new paradigm. And just to give you some concrete examples, is that done a linear, I mean, there's statistics coming out that the people going to the universities now it's about, I think, 53% women and 47% men. And they've been plotting the linear regression that by the 1240, if this continues mathematically, there won't be any men in the classes. I mentioned this before. So what we'll probably have to do is have affirmative action for men, get them in. And in fact, that's happening in some of the private schools. Is that because their standards are higher in the private schools, they're finding that they're getting more and more women, so they actually have to give points now, on the SATs for men. So you get 10 extra points if you're a man. You also get 250 extra points if you're an athlete. So they're juggling around with these systems because of the change in demographics. So in this particular scene, what we have is the three discussing quantum mechanics or the new physics. And it's the Oman is teaching or trying to explain the new physics to the two dunce of men. To the men, to the poet and the politician. And the reason that I'm showing this is because I got the film from a physics major at Colorado School of Mines. And what they had been doing is that the science school had been circulating the film around this, and I think it was made in the 70s, and actually having discussions as to what the meaning of the film is. And this very, very bright student came up and said, "Hey, Dr. Kang, have you seen this?" And I hadn't, and when I looked at it, this is really interesting. I've shown it to other professors, and they look at it as three talking heads. So I don't know what your reaction to it will be, but I think it's a real work of art.
Now, this vision of a universe arranged in harmonies, sounds, and relations is no new discovery. Today, physicists are simply proving that what we call an object, an atom, a molecule, a particle, is only an approximation, a metaphor. At the subatomic level, it dissolves into a series of interconnections. The chords of...
But there are boundaries, aren't there? I mean, between you and me, for instance. We are two separate bodies, aren't we? That's not an illusion.
At the subatomic level, there is a continual exchange of matter and energy between the wood and the air, and even between you and me. I mean, a real exchange of photons and electrons. Ultimately, whether we like it or not, we're all part of one inseparable web of relationships.
And that's the closest they'll get to anything sexual will be. No, actually not. Because in the movie, in the film, there's a daughter, and see, of course, everyone's divorced. That's the way things are in modern age, right? And so the daughter is staying with the mother on the island in the cathedral. She's 18, 21. She has a French boyfriend. And of course, she's bored all the time. But there's no sex there either. But it's a relation. I mean, what they're trying to do is put this new physics into a human context. So, and. So the other influences, they've been influencing music, and I haven't listened to this, but this comes directly out of the reading. And evidently there's something called the Gaian variations, which is an oratorio. That wouldn't be a good, I mean, that'd be, I gotta look that up and integrate it into the multimedia. So, I mean, I love oratorios, right? And of course, there's a very, very close correlation between mathematics and music. And there was an interview of the computer people studying computer science at MIT done by Shirley Turkle, which was trying to get an idea of the culture of these new people coming up. And one thing she found in common was that they loved classical music. And which composer would you think that was the favorite among these programmers? It's Bach. It's because one of the most important things to understand in computer science is recursion. And recursion is to be able to take an algorithm and do it again, but change it a bit to get a different result. And then when Turkle was talking to the computer sciences, he says, Bach, when you listen to Bach, it's recursion, because it repeats the same theme over and over again, but a little differently each time for a different effect. So, good. I don't know, you've inspired me. I think I'm going to look up, I'm going to bring in more media this time, or in the oratorio. The other influence was the Lord Isley, and I think I mentioned before. And there's a strong humanistic element to all this kind of, which you'll also see in the film. But Isley is one of the first ecologists, and he's writing a book, and he's unable to write anything. He's having a blank every time he looks at the typewriter. He's unable to do anything. So he's in Spain, and he walked out, and so he's walking along the beach, and there's this kid out there with all the starfish sweeping him up on the beach. And so the kid would go down there and take up the starfish, throw it back into the ocean. And Isley kept watching them, just pick one after another. And Isley started getting mad as a biologist. He says, you know, that's not going to make any difference. And the kid picks up another starfish and throws it into the ocean and says, it does for that one. And so Isley suddenly got, you know, the inspiration and wrote this book called The Star Thrower. And it's talking about the new ecology. And this one, I don't want to listen to it because it's horrible. But anyway, that one showed that it's international. Like all heavy metal, it's, you know, it's junk. Sorry. Did I show a bias there? Yeah, okay. And then it's influenced certain movies, virus, and then I added a new one because this wasn't in Wikipedia. It would be in Wikipedia, it should be, because what happens to Wikipedia is being edited all the time, right? So, I've mentioned this before. If you're doing an English paper for Dr. I.M. Wong, are you going to quote Wikipedia in your paper? So please don't give, I mean, because I use Wikipedia, I'm going to be looked down upon. So don't spread it around. But I think it's pretty good. So maybe Avatar will be in the new edition of Wikipedia, but I don't know how many of you saw the movie.
to talk to you about a fresh start, a new world. You'd be making a difference. I became a Marine for the hardship. Told myself I can pass any test a man can pass. All I ever wanted was a single thing worth fighting for.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're not in Kansas anymore. You're on Pandora.
You should see your faces.
We have an indigenous population called the Navi. They are very hard to kill.
This is why we're here. Because this little gray rock sells for 20 million a kilo. Their village happens to be resting on the richest deposit, and they need to relocate. Those savages are threatening our whole operation. We're on the brink of war, and you're supposed to be finding a diplomatic solution.
The concept is to drive these remotely controlled bodies with avatars. They grow from human DNA, mixed with DNA of the natives.
Marine in an avatar body. That's a potent mix.
You give me what I need, I'll see to it you get your legs back. Your real legs. How would I say?
Looks like you. This is your avatar.
Just relax and let your mind go blank. Sure you are free.
Jake, it's real simple.
I want you to learn from the inside. I want you to gain your trust.
You should not be here. Go back. Well, this is your fault.
I need your help. Outstanding.
Haven't got lost in the woods, have you?
You forget what team you're playing for? Strong, prey on the weak, and nobody does a thing. You got 1 hour.
You knew this would happen.
Everything changed. Jake, it's crazy here. The war is just rolling, and there's no stopping him.
We're going up against gunships with bows and arrows.
I guess we better stop it.
They've sent us a message that they can take whatever they want. But we will send them a message. That this is our land.
Which is kind of, you notice that there are certain memes, which I'll talk about later, is that the Gaia scientist, of course, this female, you know, they're touchy-feely, emotional types. I gotta watch that. The people are gonna do it. But again, that's the meme, and I don't think it's an accident that leaders in the ecology movement turned out to be women, including Merchant. And remember, when we're looking at Hess, we find out that all these are social constructs, and different people, different genders, different nationalities are going to construct things differently. And I'm not saying all women, because in the Mind Walk, you're going to see that the poet would say, yeah, in the 70s, Phyllis Shockley was considered the great, said that the greatest thing that happened to mankind was the invention of the atomic bomb. So obviously, I'm saying that when I make these generalizations, that's exactly what they are. But if we look at it from a cultural perspective, it seems that we can quantitatively say that the scientific leaders of the ecological movement turned out to be women, but not only women, but also women in foreign countries, like India and Australia, England. And from that perspective, I would even say that probably in terms of the feminist movement, the United States is behind most countries. And that can be quantified very simply by looking at how many female congresswomen and senators we have. Or, the other day it was argued that it certainly is great that we've got more women as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And then I calculate the percent, it's still at 2%. So, but on Avatar, when my daughter saw it, she said, this is great. Now we know what it takes to be an attractive woman in the future. You have to be 9 feet tall, green, and have a tail. Survival of the fittest. So other influences that's going on, memes is what I'm going to call them. We'll take a look at what memes are. Is Sim Earth and Final Fantasy. I don't know. Anybody play the game? And what culture does it come from? Japan, yeah. I also, it's designed in order to appeal to an international audience, and probably designed to appeal to American boys, right?
This guy says yes.
I would say, the Japanese are pretty good business people. And the Japanese have they have no feelings of inferiority. You don't see any Japanese coming to America. Just happy where they are. It's just cultural observation. So it's always been influenced. It also influenced pop culture, according to the Wikipedia article. And then I was looking for some area outside of ecology, and also outside of the of this particular community, in order to see if there's any evidence to support the idea of the Gaia hypothesis. And one part of the Gaia hypothesis, and also that goes back to Teilhard de Chardin, is that the next stage of evolution is to go from physiological, biological evolution to evolution of intelligence. And I refuted that hypothesis very easily when I told you the joke, right? How can you refute evolution and the value of a Harvard education in 2 words? George Bush. Right? So there's plenty of evidence that we're not evolving, and there's there would be plenty of, I think there's plenty of evidence that we may not be evolving from intelligence. So that could be one attack on the Gaia hypothesis. And so I'm not sure where it is, but Stephen Dawkins, my favorite atheist biologist, came up with this idea called memes. And remember, Dawkins is one of the people critiquing, criticizing the Gaia hypothesis, because Dawkins thought that the Gaia hypothesis was teleological, which means that it was heading somewhere. And remember, in the Middle Ages, everything was teleological because all of us were not evolving, but striving to reach heaven. And that it was assumed that you and I were the nexus between the lower forms of life and the angels. And that what drove this thing was this teleological force, which the Catholics called agape, or universal love. So what Dawkins, being a good atheist, says this Gaia hypothesis strikes me as being teleological, that it's bringing in this external metaphysical idea which is not allowed in science. So, yet another person has taken the idea of means within the Darwinian scheme of things and tried to fit it in not only with the new Darwinism, but with also the idea of the evolution of intelligence. And we're not going to listen to the whole thing.
Cultural evolution is a dangerous child for any species to let loose on its planet. By the time you realise what's happening, the child is a toddler up and causing havoc, and it's too late to put it back. We humans are Earth's Pandoran species. We're the ones who let the second replicator out of its box, and we can't push it back in. We're seeing the consequences all around us now. That, I suggest, is the view that comes out of taking memetics seriously. And it gives us a new way of thinking about not only what's going on our planet, but what might be going on elsewhere in the cosmos. So, first of all, I'd like to say something about memetics and the theory of means, and secondly, how this might answer questions about who's out there, if indeed anyone is. So, memetics. Memetics is founded on the principle of universal Darwinism. Darwin had this amazing idea. Indeed, some people say it's the best idea anybody ever had. Isn't that a wonderful thought, that there could be such a thing as a best idea anybody ever had? Do you think there could? Someone says no very loudly from over there. Well, I say yes, and if there is, I give the prize to Darwin. Why? Because the idea was so simple, and yet it explains all design in the universe. I would say not just biological design, but all of the design that we think of as human design. It's all just the same thing happening. What did Darwin say? I know you know the idea of natural selection, but let me just paraphrase The Origin of Species, 1859, in a few sentences. What Darwin said was something like this. If you have creatures that vary, and that can't be doubted, I've been to the Galapagos and I've measured the size of the beaks and the size of the turtle shells and so on and so on, and 100 pages later. And if there is a struggle for life such that nearly all of these creatures die, and this can't be doubted, I've read Malthus and I've calculated how long it would take for elephants to cover the whole world if they bred unrestricted and so on and so on, and another 100 pages later. And if the very few that survive pass on to their offspring whatever it was that helped them survive, then those offspring must be better adapted to the circumstances in which all this happened than their parents were. You see the idea? If, then. He had no concept of the idea of an algorithm, but that's what he described in that book. And this is what we now know as the evolutionary algorithm. The principle is you just need those three things: variation, selection, and heredity. And, as Dan Dennett puts it, if you have those, then you must get evolution. Or design for chaos without the aid of mind. There's one word I love on that slide. What do you think my favourite word is? Chaos? No. What? Mind? No. No, not without. Try them all in order, Must. This is what makes it so amazing. You don't need a designer or a plan or foresight or anything else. If there's something that is copied with variation and it's selected, then you must get design appearing out of nowhere. You can't stop it. Must is my favorite word there. Now, what's this to do with memes? Well, the principle here applies to anything that is copied with variation and selection. We're so used to thinking in terms of biology, we think about genes this way. Darwin didn't, of course, he didn't know about genes. He talked mostly about animals and plants, but also about languages evolving and becoming extinct. But the principle of universal Darwinism is that any information that is varied and selected will produce design. And this is what Richard Dawkins was on about in his 1976 bestseller, The Selfish Gene. The information that is copied, he called the replicate. It selfishly copies. Not meaning it kind of sits around inside cells going, I want to get copied, but that it will get copied if it can, regardless of the consequences. It doesn't care about the consequences because it can't, because it's just information being copied. And he wanted to get away from everybody thinking all the time about genes, and so he said, is there another replicator out there on the planet? Yes, there is. Look around you. Here we'll do in this room. All around us, still clumsily drifting about in its primeval soup of culture, is another replicator. Information that we copy from person to person by imitation, by language, by talking, by telling stories, by wearing clothes, by doing things. This is information copied with variation selection. This is design process going on. He wanted a name for the new replicator. So he took the Greek word, mimeme, which means that which is imitated. Remember that, that's the core definition, that which is imitated. And abbreviated it to mean, just because it sounds good, and made a good meme, an effective spreading meme. So that's how the idea came about. It's important to stick with that definition. The whole science of memetics is much maligned, much misunderstood, much feared, but a lot of these problems can be avoided by remembering the definition. A meme is not equivalent to an idea, it's not an idea, it's not equivalent to anything else really. Stick with the definition. It's that which is imitated, or information which is copied from person to person. So let's see some memes. You sir, you've got those glasses hung around your neck in that particularly fetching way. I wonder whether you invented that idea for yourself or copied it from someone else. If you copied it from someone else, it's a meme. And what about, I can't see any interesting memes here. Who's got some interesting memes for me? Your earrings. Now I don't suppose you invented the idea of earrings. You probably went out and bought them. There are plenty more in the shops. That's something that's passed on from person to person. And all the stories that we're telling, well, of course, TED is a great meme fest, masses of memes. The way to think about memes, though, is to think, why do they spread? They're selfish information. They will get copied if they can. But some of them will be copied because they're good or true or useful or beautiful. Some of them will be copied even though they're not. Some it's quite hard to tell why. There's one particular curious meme which I rather enjoy.
So what's the definition of memes?
That which is imitated?
What?
That which is imitated?
That which is, imitated. And it's, so there's a meme there, I don't know, 30, oh yeah, I remember Tim. Yeah, the real hero of the Super Bowl, right? So that's a meme. When I put on my jacket, it was a meme, right? And the memes are ideas that can be replicated, and that are copied and replicated. And then in the scheme of the survival of the fittest, which memes will survive and perpetuate, according to this theory. Those are the truest and most beautiful. And that's exactly, it occurred to me, that's exactly what's going on, at the universities, and that's where the true learning takes place. Is that we're passing on memes, and that they're like genes, And they reside in our brains, but they express themselves in different ways, and they're passed on, and they circulate, and they go around, and there are good memes. I mean, and how do you define good memes and bad memes? According to Darwin, the ones that help us survive and to adapt. But not only that, what we're finding out is what helps us survive and adapt, according to the Gaia theory, is also that which is most beautiful and elegant. Now that is a kind of a statement that's kind of difficult to say in these hard economic times, right? To talk about the true and the beautiful when everybody's trying to survive or get a job. But so in a lot of ways, this is out of place because when I was developing the lectures, it was good times. And now we're going through different times. But in any event, the whole idea of memes even fits into this idea that the next stage of evolution, if it takes place according to the Gaia hypothesis, is the evolution of intelligence. And, you know, this isn't the final speech. If it were, I would say go out and perpetuate good memes. Keep them circulating. And that's the real purpose of the university, right? It's not to get a job. Okay. And then the last thing is a video called Mind Walk. And again, on that one, we'll be getting the questions from the script. So watch the video and then just actually study for it, read the script. So, okay, the new physics. So what we're talking about now is Kuhn says that there's a paradigm change. And the way the paradigm change happens is that a bunch of anomalies crop up. And in this case, the anomalies will be expected anomalies, but they will involve electricity. And what happens is that nobody's really disturbed until more and more anomalies crop up, and everybody tries to explain everything according to the old paradigm or the old scientific models until some genius comes along and says, this is a bunch of nonsense. I'm going to invent my own paradigm. And that turns out to be Albert Einstein. And Einstein actually invented two paradigms. One is relativity, and the other is quantum theory. Now, Einstein would end up rejecting quantum theory. And then, so what we're in the state now in which we have two incommensurable paradigms or conflicting paradigms. One is relativity and the other is quantum theory. And what the physicists are trying to do is bring them together in this thing called the general field theory. My theory is that they're not going to succeed with it because they're too incommensurable. They just don't fit each other. And that the new paradigm will emerge out of biology. And that's why we threw in Gaia. I don't know if Gaia will be the new paradigm. I'm just saying that it's not going to come out of physics. But, you know, I've been wrong before. Okay, so let's look at, so if we look at the Newtonian universe as a particular type of paradigm, there are certain basic assumptions to these paradigms that we don't even think about. And yet, they're fundamental to the way we perceive reality. And one is space. And according to Newton, space is absolute. It's an infinite container in which molecules and atoms move. And they move according to a certain natural laws, right? Certain laws in physics. And we talked about some of how many are in the sciences in here? Okay, yeah. Well, that's where everything's shifting, right? Or towards the arts too, I suppose. 'Cause, I mean, we were in the other class. We were figuring out where the money is, and it's in IT, and also in the arts. So, because we need somebody to balance all this out, so certain assumptions is time is absolute, meaning that almost that there's this cosmic clock that just keeps ticking. And it's absolute. And then space is contained in that time. And that's responsible for change. And according to the old paradigm, change is linear. It only goes in one direction. And then the reason it only goes in one direction is because of the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law governing entropy. Okay, for you humanists, you should know the second law of thermodynamics because just like all the scientists should know Shakespeare. But basically what the second law of thermodynamics says is the universe is running down. Or, to be more precise, the universe is going from order to disorder. And then, and what's interesting about Gaia is because Gaia seems to violate or come up with a paradigm that seems to violate the second law of thermodynamics because it's talking about evolution going from the simple to the more complex and how you explain that. And we know, so if you're a pessimist and an existentialist and don't believe in God like me, again, you know, that's just a pedagogical device. But if you're an existentialist, you really love the second law of thermodynamics because it means everything is going to go to hell. But that you don't have to accept that paradigm because we all know that they're human constructs and that the Gaia construct is especially if you interpret it according to Chardin, we're really not going to hell. We're evolving into more and more sentient beings, and also the universe is becoming more sentient, meaning more intelligent. But of course, Chardin, being a good Catholic, believes in free will, so we reach the omega point, and then we have to make a decision, guys. Because if we don't make the right one, then we go to hell. Okay, yeah. And it's all coming in 2012. We know that. Right? Okay, so this is the old paradigm. And the anomaly that's going to come up, that's starting to take shape, is the electricity. And we've known about electricity for a long time. In the film, and you'll read it in the script, is that in the 18th century, people became interested in electricity, especially static electricity. So they would have this big ball of amber, and then somebody would wind it, and then you'd get your boyfriend or girlfriend to touch it, and you know, it's lots of laughs. But the one reason that they seem to have liked it is because it was a mysterious force. It's something that wasn't accountable by science. And so people started, are we not connected? Is that the problem? Is this, how about our wireless? I don't know, this technology drives me crazy. Well, there it is. See? It's just something like this force is almost magic. cette vertu presque magique, you know. So these are a couple courting each other, and he's using this, you know, dumb electrostatic machine in order to impress her. What a time. Okay. Thanks, Michael. And then, of course, the American who knew most about electricity was Benjamin Franklin, who, in the myth, and it's not a myth, he you know, flew a kite up and to have lightning strike it, see if he could somehow capture the electricity. And he was lucky that he didn't get killed. So other anomalies that were appearing in regard to electricity was one of them is a man by the name of Coulomb, who came up with what's called Coulomb's law. And the reason it's significant is that he was able to measure. And remember, the important thing in this period is to be able to quantify and put anything in mathematics that you could. And so Coulomb was one of the first to quantify electrical forces. And if you look up here, in quantifying, the equation is isomorphic with Newton's law of attraction. And if you look at the bottom one, you could say that the force is equal to some constant k times plus q times minus q divided by r, which is the distance square. See, this is why I love mathematics. It just drives me crazy. It's so beautiful. If you look at the bottom thing, that almost looks like Newton's equations. But what the anomaly is that electrical forces not only attract each other, but electric particles, we'll call it this time. But what else if they do? That would be an anomaly under Newton's paradigm. They repel each other. But nobody says, but nobody's upset. They're just anomalies, right? We'll figure out, you know, what's going on later. Thank you. So this is called Coulomb's law, and they still use it today. In fact, I was talking to the chemistry professor that I'm, you know, working with, and she says that Coulomb's law, you know, drives her students crazy because they can't apply it for some reason, and meaning her chemistry students. So another development in electricity is Volta invents the battery. So, you know, if you have kids and they enter the science fair, this is what you want them to do, right? Guaranteed to win it. Correct? And basically, in the middle are piles, and they have certain chemicals. Now, I don't know it. And then I think you pour water on it. I'm not quite sure how it works, and then you generate electricity. And then a man by the name of Galvani, in Italian, took Volta's battery, and attached it to a dead frog, and of course, you know, it made the frog twitch. So, there's a connection there. There's a lot of, you know. And at the same time, Mary Bysshe Shelley, the wife of the poet Shelley, is writing a famous novel called Frankenstein. So this is what you're going to be doing in medical school, working with dead frogs. Why would anybody want to do that? Not to mention dead people, right? You're going to have to cut up a cadaver. That's just fine. It's all a machine anyway, according to Descartes, correct? So, but what we're saying that these anomalies are cropping up in electricity. So the conclusion is that it must be a force of some kind, correct? But so. Okay, if it's a force of some kind, though, it's a strange type of force because, one, you got a positive and a negative to it. Secondly, it doesn't appear to have weight. It doesn't appear to have mass. And then it acts like a fluid. So what you have to do is take these anomalies, and in science, according to Kuhn, what you do is take the anomalies and try to fit them into the old paradigm. And then at the same time, what's going on is that remember in the time of Darwin, is that all these romantics are running around. And a lot of the romantics are rebelling against the old science. And by rebelling against the old science, they're attracted, attracted to this electrical phenomenon because it's mysterious and it can't be explained. So, and that movement was very influential at this time and is called Romanticism. Okay. And, you know, unfortunately, the video's not working, but what I had was this 19th century guy sitting on the piano, you know, playing Chopin, and then talking about Turner or some paintings. And he's saying, we romantics are basically optimistic and pessimistic, and we're looking at but we think something's wrong with this new science. I mean, old science, something wrong with the Newtonian science because it's too mechanical, you know. And so that's the context of a lot of the changes that are going on at this time. And in the video is this that so I'm the kind of person that's attracted to the mysterious, right there. No. It's this beautiful woman who comes down from the light, right? Great video. I'm sorry it doesn't work. And so, to get back to the scientific aspects, is we have a person by the name of Hans Christian Ørsted, who's a Danish physicist. He's a professor at the University of Copenhagen, and he's a chemist working with aluminum, which is kind of interesting because aluminum in those days was as valuable as gold. So, but now because of science, in fact, it was more valuable than gold. It was a rare metal that they were working with. But in working with, for whatever reason, working with aluminum, he found a connection between electricity and magnetism. And so here's the another. So if you want your kid to be a scientist, you send them, to the science fair, and you build them this machine, guaranteed to win the fair. I mean, in fact, my son built this thing called a connecting machine, in which he tested different metals and different materials as to how well it conducted electricity. Of course, he won, right? And he was going there at Martin Marietta, so I was pretty proud of that. That's because he had a good dad, but he's going. He's really. I don't know. I think he's turning into a Republican, and it really upsets me. My daughter too. They're getting all materialistic, and I'm going, God, where did we go wrong? So, but anyway, but here in this experiment, what you've got is a battery, and then you have, the important thing is to look at the wires, is that if you put a magnet next to the wire where there's a current, what happens to the compass needle? It moves. I mean, and not only that, that needle will move diametric in a orthogonal, no, not perpendicular, vertically to the direction of the current. And, all this is interesting, but they're simply, the scientists will look at, an anomaly, so what's going on, and this is how science works, and this is how science progresses, because if you have an anomaly, then what you have to do is go to look for a reason or a theory behind the anomaly and be able to come up with that theory and then make predictions from it. And so this is Orstein's experiment. But what the important part of it is that it relates or connects electrical phenomenon with magnetic phenomenon, and saying that they might be come from the same source, or they may be variations of the same thing. Then, a while back, there was a person by the name of Thomas Young who came up with the wave theory of light. And this is a video, so I'm not going to try to connect it. But basically, what it does is that he had we'll say a light machine here, and he would shoot a beam of light into a barrier with a slit in it, okay? And then it was, according to Newton, light was a particle. And this is going to be the big controversy that's going to come up with quantum mechanics. And so you can imagine a beam of particles coming out of a ray gun, hitting this barrier, and then you've got back here a recording machine, and then what you should see is just a bunch of electrons hitting here, correct? But what happens is that when he performed the experiment, the particles appeared to change to waves, and then when you looked at the pattern here, it becomes an interference pattern, which is characteristic of waves. So if you're a scientist, and he presents his findings to the other physicists, and this is always very interesting. But nobody takes it seriously, mainly because it doesn't fit into the old paradigm. Because Newton had already proven that that light consists of particles or atoms, or a kind of atom consists of particles. And yet here we have an experiment in which the light appears to act like a wave. And nobody pays any attention to it, except one person, or there are others, but the well-known person is Einstein. And he's going to look at that experiment through different eyes, or from a different perspective. And I'd submit to you that that's the essence. I mean, this is where, this dumb expression, thinking out of the box, comes from. It's because that's exactly what Einstein will be doing. He's looking at all these anomalies, and instead of trying to fit it into the old paradigm, he's going to be the type that's going to come up with a completely new paradigm. And I submit that's what genius is, right? And Einstein is one of them. Like I said, inspired Einstein. Thomas Young was an English polymath. What does that mean for the SAT scores? Means the person who is good at everything. Now, if you take this, when you see this on the MCAT, see, it'll say you give a definition of the polymath, and then one of the answers will be what? The person who's good in math, right? See how they try to trick you? See how mean and nasty they are? None of my questions are that way. See, I don't try to trick you, but they will on the MCAT. Oh, the ones that try to trick you, they're the ringers, so you just want to forget about them. Just guess. He also, and the reason, as a polymath, meaning he was good at everything, he was also good at languages, and he was able to decipher the Rosetta Stone, which is what?
Every language.
Okay, yeah, Rosetta Stone was boy, you're going to pass the MCAT. The Rosetta Stone was a language that was written on stone. That's why they called it the stone. It was a version of Egyptian hieroglyphics. And what Young was able to do was decode it and actually translate it. And there's a software now called the Rosetta Stone, right? What does it do? Teaches you languages. By the way, if you want to learn language, don't take a class here. I mean, they'll kill you. Not only that, you'll get a horrible accent, and nobody will want to listen to you. And you won't learn to speak, and that's the reason why you want to take a language, right? I mean, you'll learn to read and write, and you'll learn grammar. Great. You really want to learn French grammar. I mean, that's really going to be helpful in your career. In fact, I had a friend who was a French major, and he graduated magna cum laude. And then so we went, and he was with me in my Peace Corps group, and we went to Morocco where you had to speak French. He said he couldn't speak, for a year, he couldn't speak the word of French. I mean, because he was taught how to read and write and taught French grammar. So he went around, the only thing he could say is, "Passez du salt, s'il vous plaît." I mean, pass the salt, please. I mean, what good is that going to do you? And then finally, though, he met up with a French woman, and then, boy, his French just picked up. So he's fluent now. So, okay, so now continuing with some of the anomalies, André Ampère, French physicist and mathematician, his father was executed during the French Revolution. And what he found out is that given two wires with currents running in opposite directions, if, for example, these are wires, if they go in the same direction, what happens? What will happen to the wire? What? They repel. And then if you have two wires and they're running in the opposite, and the current's running in the opposite direction, what will happen with the wires? They attract, right? You're a good logical thinker. huh? And you're not a scientist, are you? What's going on? Where are the scientists? They should have gotten that really quickly. Maybe. I mean, maybe. But anyway, I know why you're in the sciences, because that's where the money is. I mean, that's why people are shifting you. By the way, in the history of science is that when my kids were growing up, we had the periodic, instead of a Monet or some fancy picture, we had this up on the kitchen wall. And, you know, and so now my son's a geodetic scientist and my daughter's in med school, right? So for your kids, you know, put up the periodic table, have them enter the science fair, and have the periodic table up there. Because the table gives a sense of order and structure in the universe. And if you can look at it and see the beauty, then you should be in the sciences. If you look at it and you say, God, I can't stand this because I got to memorize this crap, I think you're in the wrong profession, or studying to be in the wrong profession, right? If you can't see the beauty of, oh God, every time I look at it, I just want to cry. It's so beautiful. Okay, so then what happens is that in England, okay, we have a person by the name of Michael Faraday, and Faraday is very interesting because if we look at the cultural context of the time, we remember that the reason we don't call it Darwin's theory of evolution Wallace's theory of evolution is because Wallace came from the working class. And it's the reality of the time. So that we don't like to talk about it in America because it's not politically correct because the Republicans will say we're bringing up class warfare, and we don't talk about that. But Michael Faraday was a bookbinder, and so he's binding all these books, and then while he's binding the books, or he would borrow the books, and all of them happened to be science books in chemistry. And then he basically taught himself science, and then there was a great chemist by the name of Rutherford, who later on will work with the structure of the atom. And Rutherford was the greatest, Humphrey Davy. And Humphrey Davy was one of the greatest scientists of the day. And what Faraday did was go to Humphrey Davy's lectures, and then went up after the lecture and said, hey, could I be your lab assistant? And Humphrey said yes. And so we have basically an uneducated Brit from the working classes doing empirical experiments. And he's able to get the experiments published through Humphrey Davy. And one experiment he did which we don't have here, but what he did was he took a magnet, right? And you have your kids do this if you want them to be scientists. God forbid. They'll become scientists and then they'll turn into Republicans. Oh, horrible. Okay. But what he did was he took a magnet bar, or a bar of magnet, and you got on one side, the antipode that's positive, on the other side is negative, right? And he put a sheet of paper over it. And then he took iron filings and threw it on the sheet of paper. And then what happened? It'll be in the video, but okay, all you science majors. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. What happened was that you had these waves or lines of force going in curves around the antipodes or the two opposite ends of the positive and negative. Now this is really an anomaly because remember when we looked at the paradigms, in the Aristotelian paradigm, the natural basic motion was uniform circular motion. Then with Newton, what did it turn out to be? The vector, which is a straight line. And now what we have is this experiment that has a curve, these curved lines going on it. So again, it's an anomaly, and most people are looking at it and says, okay, we have to deal with it within the Newtonian paradigm. And the other thing that Faraday did was invent the the electric motor. And basically, what you would do is that if you had he took a U-shaped magnet, right? And then on one end would be the positive attraction, the other would be negative. And then he took a piece of wood and wrapped copper wire around it, and then attached wires to each end, and then moved the copper wire up and down, and then as a consequence was able to generate electricity, which becomes your electric motor. Which is, another science experiment for your kids. And so we have this uneducated man from the working classes inventing the electric motor, essentially. And so what happens, though, is that in science, what do you have to do before you can be considered a scientist? Regardless. What? Okay, you have to go to school, and then what do you have to learn in school? Or what's one of the prerequisites? Well, you have to quantify it, is what we're saying. You have to be able to explain all these anomalies in mathematical equations. So that's why they get paid more, right? Because nobody can do math. And yet it's the math that's the basis of all the goodies that we get. See, Michael, this would not be possible without quantum mechanics, what we're doing. Okay, okay, so bless you. But a man by the name of James Clerk Maxwell, who's a Scot, mathematician and a physicist, explained all this phenomenon through something called Maxwell's equations. And you're very lucky because I can't connect to them. But so you might want to look them up and just look at them because they're really beautiful equations. In fact, they're so famous. So, for example, if you look at, if you got Newton's law of gravitation, in France they'll call it something else. But Maxwell equations are so fundamental in world science is that everybody refers to the equations as Maxwell equations. And I think that's the only set of equations that people don't translate. So if you're in Japan, you can speak Japanese by saying Maxwell's equations, right? Because it's the same all over the world. And now, the interesting thing about Maxwell's equations is that what it describes is a field of force. And in order to have this force field, you have to introduce something else in order to explain it, and that's the ether. And the mathematics pointed that if Maxwell's equations are correct, then what we need is an ether. Which is kind of interesting because Newton got rid of the ether, right? Because space was absolute and completely empty and only a container, and with an infinite container with nothing in it. And that was where your particles move, and they're operated according to Newton's law, which is force equals some constant g times the product of the two masses divided by distance square, which is isomorphic with Coulomb's law. But here's the interesting thing, is that for years, I mean for 100 years, you're taught that space was empty. And then suddenly Maxwell says, no, I mean, it can't be empty, because if you have empty space, there's no way that we can explain the propagation of waves. Right? It's like looking for the Higgs particle today. Hate to make a prediction, they're not going to find it. Billions of dollars for these dumb scientists these brilliant scientists trying to find the Higgs particle. They're not going to find it. Because the paradigm's wrong. Because the paradigm's changed. What they did find, which is, what did they find that upset, another anomaly that upset everybody? They found that some of the neutrino, they found neutrinos that can go faster than the speed of light. So what's the big deal? According to Einstein, nothing can go faster than the speed of light. And what you learn from Burke is that when you find one anomaly that can't be explained, the whole paradigm breaks down. So right now, everybody's trying to explain why in this experiment, which was discovered by some Italians, by the way. And then the CERN people said, oh, no, it can't be right. And they ran the same experiment in France, and they came to the same conclusion. But it's a matter of time where they'll just explain it away. Yeah?
I heard it was debunked.
It was debunked? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm told that it's already been debunked, that in the experiments they failed to set the instruments right for the correct measurement. And this goes on all the time. But it would have been predictable, because if they did discover neutrinos that go faster than the speed of light, then they're going to have to throw out all of Einstein. The multiple choice question. Light is cannot or can, one of them it says, which is true. Nothing can go faster than the speed of light, and that's the true one, but they'd have to change that on the MCAT. And then, yeah, make it false. And then all the people who construct the tests will get upset. Right. We can't do it. Okay, but the important thing is that what Maxwell's equation did was introduce the concept of the ether. And so what we have to do now is that, okay, according to the math, we have to bring in the ether. Just like according to the math, we have to bring in the Higgs particle, and then that they're looking for in CERN. And basically, if you see the lines of force coming down, that's the ether, what we could call the ether wind. And then if you have the Earth going around the sun, is that correct, by the way? Is that? Okay. I forget anymore, you understand. Can't keep up with these new theories. So you have the Earth going around the sun, then what will happen is that if you mount an instrument on the Earth, then you should be able to detect this ether wind. And so next time, what will happen, we'll look at what's called the Michelson-Morley experiment when in the British and American physicists designed this machine that they mounted on the Earth, and what they were going to do is detect the ether. And then what you might want to do is start looking at the film, so some of this will make more sense during the lecture, so you have some background.